Underneath the noise of daily life, where everyone fights to be heard, you chose silence. Not out of weakness, not because you ran out of things to say, but because you finally understood that real transformation doesn't need to be announced. It pulses in the quiet, and suddenly, the people who used to laugh when you spoke are now afraid or silent. They can't figure out what happened to you. You used to defend yourself. You used to explain, apologize, over-express. But now, your stillness speaks louder than your old words ever could. And it's terrifying for them, because when someone who used to break at every criticism becomes quiet, it means they've rebuilt themselves from a place no one can reach. This is not the silence of someone defeated. It's the silence of someone who finally realized their value wasn't negotiable. You stopped trying to be understood because you understood yourself. And that alone shifted your energy so drastically that people feel uncomfortable around you without even knowing why. There is something deeply unsettling about a person who no longer reacts. It exposes the manipulation, the games, the hidden intentions. You used to light up the room by trying to be everything for everyone. Now, you walk into a space and say nothing, and people rearrange themselves. They feel the weight of your energy not because it's loud, but because it's grounded, still, sovereign. Silence, when it comes from healed awareness, is not empty. It's loaded with all the battles you fought alone, all the boundaries you finally learned to hold, all the times you chose to pause instead of explode. And that kind of silence is radioactive. It doesn't need confrontation to be powerful. It just exists. And it makes people confront their own noise. People who underestimated you did so because they depended on your emotional transparency. They fed off your need to explain, to be liked, to be approved. They knew how to trigger you because you used to give them the manual, but you took it back. You unplugged the wires they used to pull your reactions, and now they're left staring at a version of you they don't recognize, and it terrifies them. What changed wasn't your voice. It was your frequency. You started to speak only when something needed to be said. You stopped offering explanations to those committed to misunderstanding you. You began to walk away without turning into a storm. And in that quiet exit, you left echoes that now haunt those who once dismissed you. It's funny how people claim they want peace, but when you become peace, they panic. Because your stillness reveals their chaos. Your calmness highlights their dysfunction. And suddenly, the one they labeled too sensitive is now the one who makes the whole room uncomfortable just by standing still. This is the kind of power that cannot be faked. It's not dominance, it's presence. And presence is earned in the dark, not on the stage. You earned it in the nights you cried silently, praying for clarity. In the moments when you said nothing but felt everything. In the discipline it took to hold your tongue when your ego wanted revenge. That's where your silence was born, in the fire. It came out forged, not broken. And now, when you don't reply, it's not because you're weak. It's because it's not worth your energy. When you leave a message unread, it's not disrespect. It's alignment. When you walk away, it's not to punish. It's to protect your frequency. You've learned that not everything deserves a reaction. Not every insult needs a counterattack. Not every loss is worth chasing back. Your silence is not absent. It's strategy. It's elevation. And the higher you go, the quieter it gets. Not because there's nothing to say, but because you've already said enough in who you've become. And so, the silence grows. And with it, your presence becomes undeniable. Those who once depended on your doubt now tremble in front of your self-trust. Because now, you don't explain yourself, you just are. And there is nothing scarier to small minds than someone who no longer needs to be understood. Now that they can't read you, they fear you. Because in your silence, you reclaimed all the power they thought they had over you. And that's why they're afraid. Not because you're loud, but because you're finally free. There's something deeply mysterious about the kind of transformation that doesn't announce itself. You didn't post about it. You didn't warn anyone. There were no dramatic exits or emotional breakdowns on display. You simply disappeared from the drama, from the expectations, from the version of yourself they used to access at will. And when you re-emerged, you weren't louder. You were cold, sharper, still. It's ironic, isn't it? how silence, once used against you as a form of punishment, became your greatest weapon. The silence they used to make you feel invisible is now the very thing making them uncomfortable in your presence. You used to fill every gap in the room with nervous words, over-explaining your actions, apologizing for taking up space. But now you let silence hang heavy. You let them sit with the weight of their own discomfort. This shift isn't a strategy you learned in a book. It was carved out of necessity. It was the result of heartbreaks you never spoke of, disappointments that drained you to the core. The moment you realized that trying to be understood by those who thrive on misunderstanding you was a game you'd always lose, so you stopped playing. You didn't even say, "I'm done." You just were. And this silence, it changed everything. People now walk on eggshells around you, not because you've become threatening, but because your energy no longer allows access without intention. You've stopped performing emotional labor for people who never reciprocated. You don't soften your truth anymore to make others feel comfortable. And the ones who used to feed off your emotional vulnerability now starve in your presence. There's a kind of clarity that comes only after chaos, the kind that no longer seeks revenge, but simply refuses to engage. You stopped trying to fix others. You stopped trying to prove your worth. You learned that not everyone who calls you too much is qualified to carry the weight of your truth. This isn't just a silence born of maturity. It's born of awareness. Awareness that some people only kept you close because you didn't know who you were. You were manageable, predictable, compliant, but now you've remembered. You've remembered what you were before you were told who to be. And that's what they fear the most, the return of your original frequency. You see, there's a sacred power in detaching, not from people, but from needing anything from them. The moment you release the need to be seen, validated, praised, or invited, you become untouchable, because nothing owns you anymore. Not approval, not history, not obligation. You become the mirror they cannot escape. Have you noticed how people begin to rewrite the past when your silence exposes their version of the truth? They start calling you cold because you stopped giving them access to your warmth. They say you've changed because they can no longer manipulate you. They call you distant because they no longer live at the center of your emotional universe. Let them, because what they're really reacting to is the fact that you are no longer a character in their script. You've taken back your narrative. And silence is the language of those who no longer seek permission to exist. This silence isn't passive, it's revolutionary. It's the sound of chains breaking, the echo of identity being reclaimed. And if it makes people uncomfortable, that's not your responsibility. Your peace is not an act of aggression, it's a boundary. And those who are offended by your were never rooting for it to begin with. But let's go deeper. Silence, in its truest form, is not about withdrawal. It's about realignment. When you go quiet, you start to hear everything. Your intuition sharpens, your nervous system recalibrates. You begin to discern energy instead of words. You see intentions without needing explanation. You sense shifts in people without confrontation. You become fluent in the unspoken. And that's where your power truly multiplies. Because now, you don't just listen to people, you feel them. You don't just hear what they say, you understand what they hide. Your silence has turned you into a frequency detector. You feel lies vibrate through the air. You sense truth before it's spoken. And that kind of presence, that's a threat to anyone who operates in deception. This is why people who once manipulated you now avoid you. You've become too clear, too aware, too much of a mirror for their projection. They preferred the version of you that was noisy, confused, reactive, because that version was easier to manage. But this you, the one who sees through game, who doesn't explain, who simply walks away, that version terrifies them. And still, you remain kind. That's what they don't understand. Your silence is not cruelty, it's discernment. You don't hate them. You've simply chosen peace over performance, growth over comfort, depth over distraction. They don't fear your silence because it's empty. They fear it because it's full of clarity, boundary, self-respect, full of all the things they once tried to strip from you. And now, you don't even flinch when you're misunderstood. You don't chase closure. You don't demand explanations. You don't defend what doesn't resonate. You simply keep walking, with your silence as armor and your energy as proof. Because some things no longer need to be said, they just need to be lived. You didn't become more silent because you had nothing to say. You became silent because you realized your energy was too valuable to waste on explanation that always fell on deaf ears. It was never about proving you were right. It was about protecting what was left of you. Somewhere along the line, you stopped needing them to understand. And that moment, that sacred moment, was the beginning of your emancipation. Think back to how many times you tried to clarify yourself to people who had already made up their minds. How many versions of the truth did you offer? How many layers of your heart did you peel back, hoping they'd just see you? And now you understand. It was never a lack of communication. It was a lack of willingness on their part to receive you in your entirety. You're no longer in the business of being decoded. This shift is not arrogance, it's healing. You finally stopped contorting yourself to fit molds you were never designed for. You've stopped shrinking your light to make others feel more comfortable in their shadow. You've stopped letting chaos rent space in your nervous system just to maintain relationships that fed on your silence, not your soul. And here's what people rarely talk about. Silence isn't just the absence of noise, it's the presence of power. The kind of power that radiates without performance. The kind that doesn't enter a room with volume, but with vibration. People feel you differently now, don't they? It's not that you became louder, it's that you became real. And in a world addicted to noise, real is terrifying. Take a moment to recognize what you've built in your stillness. The calm that now lives in your bones wasn't always there. It had to be earned through grief, through surrender, through the courageous decision to no longer betray yourself, just to belong. Your silence isn't empty. It's filled with every lesson you bled for. You've become fluent in the language of restraint, and in that silence, you learned who was there for your essence, not your usefulness. You saw who stayed when you stopped explaining, who reached out when you didn't initiate, who saw your worth when you weren't performing emotional CPR on everyone else. And for the first time, you chose yourself. This, of course, has consequences. The people who once fed on your insecurity will now call you selfish. The ones who used your kindness as leverage will accuse you of being distant. The ones who relied on your silence to control you will now claim you're acting brand new. But deep down, they know the truth. They didn't expect you to rise in your absence. They thought silence would bury you, but you used it as a womb. Every period of stillness in your life, those nights you cried alone, those days you felt invisible, those moments you questioned your own worth, was never a grave. It was preparation. You weren't dying. You were gestating, becoming, remembering. And now that you've emerged, more rooted, more discerning, more whole, they're unsettled because you're not the same. You're not accessible in the ways you once were. Your energy doesn't say, "Please like me," anymore. It says, "You'll either align or you'll exit." And that level of detachment is divine. Here's the truth they won't say out loud. They miss the version of you who didn't know your power. The one who overextended, overgave, overexplained. The one who absorbed their projections and called it connection. The one who wore silence like shame instead of sovereign. But you know better now. You know silence can be soft without being weak. You know boundaries can be kind without being loud. You know healing isn't always about confrontation. It's often about walking away with your dignity intact and your peace preserved. You've stepped into a new vibration, one where energy speaks louder than words, one where presence matters more than performance, one where you no longer chase, beg, or bend. You simply are. And that version of you, that's the version no one saw coming. And perhaps what's most beautiful about your silence is that it's no longer reactive. It's chosen. You don't go quiet out of fear, you go quiet out of power, out of trust, out of alignment with a deeper truth that no longer needs validation. You've learned to let people misunderstand you, mislabel you, even vilify you, because you've finally chosen peace over being liked. You've tasted the freedom of not explaining yourself, and it's addictive. You've witnessed the strength in non-response, and it's revolutionary. You've discovered that silence doesn't need defense. It is the defense. And now, Now you move differently, you protect differently, you love differently. There is no going back. Because once you understand the sacredness of your own frequency, you stop letting just anyone tune into it. You no longer waste your voice trying to wake people committed to misunderstanding. You let your evolution speak for itself. And those who feel threatened by your silence, they were never in harmony with your truth. Let that be your clarity, and let the silence remain your sanctuary. You start to notice something strange. The quieter you become, the more people start projecting their insecurities onto you. It's not even what you said, it's what you didn't say. It's the way you stopped over-explaining, the way you no longer apologize for existing, the way you look them in the eye and say absolutely nothing, and somehow that says everything. This is the paradox of true growth. You become more invisible to the crowd, and yet more radiant to those who can truly see. It's unsettling to them, isn't it? The version of you that doesn't play by the old rules anymore. The one who no longer flinches when they use silence as a weapon. Because now it's your shield. The one who doesn't reply to manipulation with panic, but with peace. There is a deep discomfort people feel when they can no longer predict you, when they realize you've stopped giving them the script. And here's where the real shift begins. You stop seeing your silence as loneliness and begin to recognize it as your sanctuary. The noise you used to chase, approval, validation, applause, no longer excites you. You realize that in most of those interactions, you were performing, not participating. You weren't connecting. You were translating yourself into a language they could understand, even if it meant losing your essence in the process. That version of you no longer exists. You buried them with grace and gave birth to someone quieter, but infinitely more powerful. There's an old spiritual truth that says, when you stop talking, the soul starts speaking. And what your soul whispers in these moments of silence isn't always gentle. It's revolutionary. You begin to see your past patterns with terrifying clarity. The way you begged for crumbs when you were the feast. The way you allowed silence to be imposed on you instead of chosen. The way you kept shrinking to fit into relationships that were never designed to hold your full weight. And now, in the stillness, you begin to reintroduce yourself to yourself. It's not about revenge, it's about restoration. You're not trying to prove a point to them. You're proving one to yourself, that you can be powerful and peaceful, that you can be present without performing, that you can hold your energy like royalty and not spill it for anyone who demands it. You become deeply selective, not out of bitterness, but out of reverence. You start treating your presence like a privilege, not a given. You no longer beg to be understood, because your peace is no longer negotiable. And that shift, that silent, sacred shift, is the revolution that no one saw coming. Even your body feels it. The muscles that used to tense up in people-pleasing now rest in confidence. Your voice, once trembling with the fear of rejection, now settles calmly into truth. Your eyes, once searching for approval, now observe without attachment. And the people who used to read you like a book, they find the pages have changed, the language has changed, and they were never fluent in your truth to begin with. This is where energy speaks louder than words. Have you noticed how the same people who once mocked your silence now ask you what's wrong? They can feel the change, but they don't have the vocabulary to describe it. They sense a boundary they never expected, a dignity they once took for granted, a presence that no longer seeks their permission. That's what scares them. Because silence, when it's rooted in self-awareness, becomes a mirror. And most people aren't ready to see their own reflection without distortion. When you no longer engage in their chaos, they are left alone with their own noise. And in that void, they confront the truth. It was never you. It was always them. And while they wrestle with their discomfort, you keep building. In silence, you build resilience. You build boundary. You build clarity. You start attracting people who honor your stillness instead of trying to interrupt it. You magnetize those who don't need to be entertained, but who find your peace captivating. You meet those rare souls who speak the language of silence, who understand that sacred energy doesn't need to shout to be felt. That's when you know your silence has stopped being armor and become a signal to the world that you are no longer who you were. You are no longer the one who seeks love from those who cannot love themselves. You are no longer the one who dims your light to fit inside fragile egos. You are no longer the one who equates attention with affection. You have stepped beyond all of it, and your silence declares it more loudly than any speech ever could. And the ones who underestimated you, they'll say you changed, and you did. But what they don't realize is, this is who you were before the world taught you to perform. This is the voice you silenced to survive, the energy you buried to be accepted, the wisdom you ignored to belong. And now, you've reclaimed all of it. Without fanfare, without warning, without asking for applause. You just became. And that, more than anything, is what they fear. Not your noise, not your anger, not your retaliation. What they fear is your stillness, your serenity, your refusal to explain. Because now, they realize the game is over. You don't need to win. You already walked away. And what they hear now is the sound of their own fear echoing in the space where your voice used to be. There's a moment, quiet, private, almost imperceptible, when you realize you no longer need to be understood. It doesn't come with a dramatic scene or a final confrontation. It arrives in the stillness, in that sacred pause between the chaos of who you used to be and the peace of who you are becoming. And in that moment, something in you exhales for the first time in years. This is where your silence becomes something entirely different. Not just a response, not just a defense, but a declaration. You're not hiding. You're not withdrawing. You're not suppressing your truth. You're embodying it so deeply that words are no longer enough. You've become fluent in a language most people have never heard, a frequency of presence, of integrity, of anchored selfhood that doesn't ask for validation. It simply is. And the beauty of it? You start seeing the world through different eyes. Where once you would have fought to explain yourself, now you just smile. You recognize projections for what they are. Unhealed parts of others trying to name you. You see that their discomfort is not your burden, that their inability to receive you isn't your fault. You stop interpreting rejection as a reflection of your worth and begin to understand it as redirection, proof that your energy has evolved beyond their grasp. Because you've learned the most radical lesson of all. Not everyone is meant to witness your blooming. Some people only loved the version of you that was convenient. That was easy to manipulate. That played small enough to make them feel big. But now, you've outgrown the cage, and you've done it in silence. Not with noise, not with announcements, but with internal revolution. You walked away from conversations that went nowhere, from relationships that fed on your insecurities, from rooms that drained your spirit. And you did it without slamming doors. You just stopped knocking. And the people who once called you too sensitive, too intense, too quiet, now find themselves unsettled. Because nothing is more intimidating than someone who's healed so quietly. They didn't even realize you were leaving until you were already gone. Let's be honest, it's not the silence that scares them. It's the power behind it. The power of someone who no longer seeks permission, who no longer explains their intuition, who no longer bleeds just to keep others comfortable. The power of someone who has stopped responding to energy that doesn't align, who has learned that peace is a choice, and sometimes that choice looks like disappearing from the places where your presence was never truly seen. And what happens then? You begin to attract everything that matches your new frequency. The conversations deepen, the relationships mature, the opportunities align. You start meeting people who don't flinch at your depth, who see your silence and feel safe, not threatened, who don't just listen when you speak, but understand when you don't. People who find your stillness magnetic, who respect your boundaries, not because you enforce them, but because you embody them. This is the divine consequence of silent growth. You stop begging for tables and start building your own altar. And at those altars, you no longer sacrifice your intuition. You no longer offer up your self-worth. You no longer trade your truth for temporary belonging. You sit in reverence with the version of you who survived it all, not with noise or rebellion, but with quiet dignity, with sacred restraint, with the kind of grace that terrifies the egoic world. because they thought your silence was weakness, but it was always your weapon. And now, it's your crown. You begin to understand that you don't have to raise your voice to raise your vibration. That sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is to keep your peace while others lose theirs. To stay grounded while the storm circles. To walk away without the need for a final word, because you've already said everything by leaving. This isn't just maturity. This is mastery. This is the point where your silence becomes your authority, where your restraint speaks louder than retaliation, where your decision to disengage doesn't come from fear, but from sovereignty, from the deep knowing that what's meant for you will never require you to shrink, to beg, to prove. You realize that silence was never emptiness. It was space. Space for your real self to emerge. Space for your spirit to stretch. Space for truth to echo in ways that noise never could. It was in the silence that you remembered your power, that you heard your own voice again, not the one shaped by expectation, but the one born of truth. And now, they're listening, but it's too late. Because you're no longer performing for an audience that never deserved the show. You're no longer dancing for crumbs. You've become your own source, your own validation, your own witness. And from this place, you no longer need to speak to be heard. You just walk into the room and everything changes. Because the real shift isn't what you say. It's who you've become in the absence of noise, in the depth of your stillness, in the sanctuary of your own presence. And maybe that's the most beautiful revenge of all. You didn't raise your voice. You raised your standard. You didn't burn bridges. You built boundaries. You didn't retaliate. You resurrected, quietly, completely. And now they're terrified, because you don't need to prove anything. You already are.